All right, so this is part one of the scale and spatial illusion section. We're going to talk about scale and proportion. Scale and proportion are related terms, so basically they both refer to size. So scale is a means of measuring or an instrument or machine for weighing. So when we think of like a literal scale, something you would put in to find out the weight, or we could talk about a ruler, some sort of tape measure, those are all instruments of scale or a way of understanding the size and weight of a thing. All right, proportion. So proportion is size measured against other elements or against a mental norm or standard. So over here we have an example by Richard Roth. So we see this giant sphere, and how we know it's giant is because there's this little stool next to it. So we're able to understand the scale of this sphere based on our ability to understand the proportion of that stool. So because we can imagine sitting in that stool, we can imagine standing next to it, we can get a good idea of how large this other thing is. So the scale is determined by our ability to compare and contrast these two objects and imagine ourselves in that space and see what they would be like. All right, another way we look at scale in art is just the size of the thing itself. So to get started, this is a Chinese medallion from the Ming Dynasty. It's about 3 inches in diameter, so it would sit in the palm of your hand. So this kind of relatively small object is something that is so ornate, so detailed, so unbelievably well made and just intricately made, and yet it sits in the palm of your hand. It's almost like holding the whole world in the palm of your hand. So the fact that it's small and the size of the thing is really important to understanding how we're supposed to experience it and what effect it's supposed to have on us. So being very small is an intricate part of understanding this piece. All right, in contrast to that, this is something that's large. So this is called Typewriter Eraser Scale X. This is an outdoor sculptural piece by Klaus Oldenburg and Kuze von Bruggen. And so we see this really kind of large object, and we know it's large because we can see that building and that tree behind it. We're able to kind of understand the size of it because we know that those are both very large things in proportion to us, at least, at our body. And the object itself, typewriter eraser, is, I think, a small tool. Not being someone who uses typewriters myself, is a small tool that would be kind of in the innards of a typewriter. And that is such a funny thing to make large. So you almost kind of feel the humor of the thing. There's something that's this kind of small piece of this bigger machine being giant and isolated kind of gives a little, I don't know, it feels a little bit like a joke to me. So the size of that piece really gives us the entire message of it being large. All right, so this one is going to be the largest that we're looking at. So this is a piece called Spider. It was created between approximately 500 BCE and 500 CE in Peru, and it's a Nazca earth drawing. So these are giant geoglyphs. So these are designs and motifs that were etched into the ground. They're located in this Peruvian coastal plain that is about 250 miles south of Lima. So these geoglyphs are actually indented into the ground. So they would kind of bury into the ground, and it would create this value contrast where basically it would appear that that rock was lighter than the rock on the surface. And so we were able to see these. Now, for scale, you can notice there's a bunch of other lines that are nearby. So some of them are roads, but you also see that there's these 2 lines that are kind of grooving all over the place. So those are actually trucks of tires or cars. And so when we can see those lines, you can see how big this spider really is. And when you think of the scale of it and what that means, the people that made this piece would never be able to get up high enough to actually see what they were making. So this was clearly not about humans. This was about the heavens. It was about divinity and about God. So the scale of it is the most important thing about it. It being large tells us what this piece is about. It's about communication with the ether, with the others, with the heavenly. Okay. So this is hieractic scaling. a composition in which the size of figures is determined by their thematic importance. So this is another thing that has to do with divinity. So in this two-dimensional image, we see several different figures, and this piece is called Saint Lawrence Enthroned with Saints and Donors. So this is a religious painting, and how we know that Saint Lawrence is the most important is because he's the biggest figure, and he's right in the middle. Now we see two figures to the right and left of him. They're a little bit smaller than him, and then there's some figures right on the bottom, and they almost look like children, but they're actually, adults. They're just smaller. So we can guess that St. Lawrence is the most important. The two guys on the right are maybe saints, and then the guys on the bottom are probably donors. So their relative value in terms of heavenliness is defined on how big they are. So this is a very religious way of scaling people and showing importance that way. Okay, another way to think about scale is a distortion of it. So this is an example of a surrealistic artwork. And surrealism is an artistic style that stresses fantastic and subconscious approaches to art making and often results in images that cannot be rationally explained. So this is a piece called Personal Values by René Magritte. And so this is just a really strange painting because it's really, all these things are really photorealistic. That comb looks so real, and so does that glass. But why is the comb bigger than the bed? And, it just sort of like places everything in these really odd ways. And so by making the proportions really odd, it creates this sort of fantastical world where we don't really know what's what. We don't know what's important. It doesn't kind of relate to our world. And so it's just stresses the fantastical in this really unique way. Okay, so we're going to get into standards. So rather than distorting them, this is how standards were kind of made. So this is a piece called Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci, a very famous piece. It created this idea of a canon in the art world. So a canon is a law or accepted code that prescribes a set of standards. So this piece is based, it created kind of a ratio or a standard for how the body should be drawn two-dimensionally to create these ideal standards. So it was based on this Roman architect named Vitruvius, who first set standards in architecture. So Da Vinci's giving an homage by calling it Vitruvian Man, but it was this beginning of these rules that certain things should be a certain way. So for example, in this drawing, the body height is 8 heads tall. So if you measured the height of the head in this drawing, it would be, and multiplied it times 8, then you would get the height of the body. And another example is that the outstretched arms equal the height of the figure. So by laying out these mathematical equations of how the body should be drawn, he starts creating a standards for drawing and realism, but also idealism and divinity. So it's kind of going back and forth there. And when sometimes people talk about the canon in art, so it's a standard that everything else afterwards is based upon. Now this has fallen apart a little bit, but for the most part, it was rigidly followed for a very long time. That proportion had to be based on specifically this canon, but also others like it. Okay, so let's talk about geometry and more notions of the ideal. So this is the golden rectangle, and this is the ancient Greek ideal of perfectly proportioned rectangle using a mathematical ratio called the golden mean. So we're going to talk a little bit more the golden mean in a second, but we're really thinking about idealism and ratios. So the ancient Greeks desired to discover proportions, and they took the form of mathematical ratios. So the golden rectangle is often used in architecture. It's subjective, but this is a subjective tool of measurement, but it also has a lot of authority because these patterns are found to be true in the real world. So you can find this mathematical equation in nature, in plants, and even in human anatomy. So it is something that was created by man to create this kind of perfect architecture, but it also has this kind of origin in nature. So okay, so this is the golden mean, and this is what created the golden triangle. So again, idealism and math. So the golden mean is a mathematical ratio in which width is to length as length is to length plus width. This ratio has been employed in design since the time of the ancient Greeks. It can also be found in natural forms. Now, I have to say that we're getting into complex areas right now. I mean, you could take a whole class about the golden mean. There is a long and rich history of it, but it's just something interesting to know about that proportion was kind of really controlled by this golden mean for a long time, proportion in artwork specifically. So this is an example of a chambered nautilus shell. So we can see that it perfectly kind of imitates the golden rectangle right there. So the golden mean is also found in the Fibonacci sequence, which is this really famous mathematical sequence. It appears in music. It can be found in nature, such as this shell. So again, it had a lot of authority in how we divided up paintings and 2D representation of space and proportion for a long time. So it was about divinity, idealism, and kind of that sort of expression of art.